Mornings in Willowbend have a serene charm that feels almost special. Mist floats between tall pine trees, and the fresh scent of damp earth and wild thyme fills the air. I had been living in a rustic cabin at the valley's edge, where quiet was a constant part of my life. That changed one memorable morning when I stumbled upon a tiny orange kitten curled up beneath my old woodshed, its fragile body shivering. Above it, on the decaying roof, sat a wild falcon. She wasn't just watching the kitten, she was fiercely guarding it. As I stepped closer, the frosty grass crunched under my boots. I raised my hands instinctively, as if to ease any tension in the air. The kitten let out a faint whimper, almost lost in the gentle breeze, but my focus remained on the falcon. She held her ground, wings slightly spread, talons gripping the edge of the roof, watching me intently. I had seen many birds of prey, hawks, eagles, and even the occasional owl, but this one felt different. Her gaze was sharp and protective, as if she claimed the kitten and wanted me to understand her intent. Kneeling down, I noticed the falcon emit a sudden, piercing cry that shattered the morning stillness. I stopped in my tracks. In an instant, she dove toward me, her wings slicing through the air before pulling back just inches from my head. It was a clear warning, one I grasped immediately. With my heart pounding, I took a step back. What was happening before my eyes? For the next hour, I watched from a distance, crouched behind the woodshed, my breath forming puffs in the crisp air. The falcon, whom I would later name Rook, hopped down to the kitten, gently prodding it with her beak. She seemed to bring small pieces of raw meat, likely from some unfortunate squirrel, carefully placing them at the kitten's feet. Yet the little one didn't eat. He gazed up at her with wide eyes, as if she were the only stable presence in his bewildered world. In that moment, I understood this was more than just a chance encounter. It marked the beginning of an unspoken connection. Over the next 2 days, I observed them as though I were a visitor in my own yard. I positioned food and water just a few feet away from the woodshed, but Rook always made sure to keep me at least 10 yards away. Whenever I crossed that invisible line, she would take to the sky, calling out fiercely, her wings spread wide. The message was unmistakable: stay back. She had taken on the role of caregiver for the kitten, becoming its mother, protector, and even a sort of bodyguard. By the third morning, I decided to call the kitten Noodle. He was now wobbling around on his little shaky legs. Interestingly, he only ate the food that Rook brought him, ignoring what I offered. This left me feeling puzzled. After all, a falcon shouldn't act this way, and a kitten shouldn't have made it through the cold without proper care. Yet somehow they were managing to look after each other. Then Mara arrived. It was nice to see her. She ran the local wildlife rehabilitation center. With her mix of scientific knowledge and intuition, she was sharp with animals but direct with people. "You need to step in," she said, hands on her hips as she scanned the yard. "This isn't normal. That falcon isn't acting right. There could be illness, injury, or maybe she lost a chick." I found myself at a loss for words. I realized that if I tried to reach for Noodle, Rook would react. Part of me respected that instinct. There was a special bond between them, and I hesitated to interfere simply because I didn't fully understand what was going on. By the 5th morning, I came across a troubling sight near the woodshed. The frost was disturbed, marked by tracks where something had moved awkwardly, dragging or limping, leaving thin strands of dark blood that glistened in the morning light. A chill, not from the mountain air, crept down my back as I approached. My eyes roamed the area until they landed on a small, curled-up figure by the shed. Noodle was huddled tightly, his tiny body shivering, and his tail flicked nervously, signaling that something was off. But it wasn't just Noodle that had me frozen. It was the unsettling silence above. Rook wasn't on the roof anymore. Instead, she was sitting lower on a fence post, her wings slightly spread and her feathers ruffled. Her eyes were half closed in fatigue, indicating that something was wrong. As I got closer, I noticed a jagged wound beneath her wing, with dried blood clinging to the injury and inflamed tissue pulsing beneath her trembling form. The wound looked old, suggesting it had happened days ago, possibly around the time she first showed up. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. She hadn't come to care for the kitten purely out of instinct or a fleeting impulse of nature. she found herself alone, feeling too hurt to take a step and too proud to reach out for help. In the midst of her struggle, she stumbled upon Noodle, a small and vulnerable kitten, equally lost and in need of companionship. Calling Mara was an instinctive choice for me. She arrived soon after, her concern evident but controlled. As she entered the clearing, Rook, the falcon, lifted into the air with a sharp cry. It wasn't as fierce as before, but there was still a strong protective instinct that caught Mara by surprise. Below, Noodle arched his back, his wide eyes showing a surprising spirit for such a young creature. He let out a thin hiss, defensive yet fragile. Mara turned to me, a slight disbelief softening her expression. "They've imprinted," she said quietly, "on each other." Her words lingered, heavy with meaning. I didn't rush to respond. Instead, I watched the two of them, two wounded souls connected by experiences we couldn't fully grasp. It was clear that whatever bond was forming between them needed to be approached delicately. Mara moved slowly around the clearing, her arms crossed as she scrutinized the falcon from various angles. She had encountered many animals before, like owls that adapted to city noise and hawks mourning lost nests. But this connection between predator and prey was different. It felt somewhat unnatural, yet oddly fitting. Rook stood guard, her wings slightly raised, trembling with each breath, while Noodle curled near her, not quite touching but always close, basking in her shadow. The space between them was charged with an unspoken understanding. Meanwhile, Theo, who had come up from the city a couple of days earlier to check on me, leaned against the porch rail, coffee mug in hand. He looked skeptical. "You can't be serious," he said, glancing at Noodle. "It's a falcon. It eats things like him." He took a sip of coffee, as if that simple act could make sense of the unexpected pair before us, his orderly view of the world unable to embrace this unusual connection. I kept quiet. I didn't have answers, just the instinct to observe and give them both the space to explore this unexpected relationship. Each time I approached, Rook's warning call echoed, quieter now, as if she were exhausted. They were both weary, yet clinging to each other, maybe hoping the world would leave them undisturbed, at least for a little while. That week, the weather took a sharp turn. The nights turned cold, and the wind from the ridgeline swept in, whistling through the pines and rattling the loose shingles of the cabin. I set up a tarp by the shed, leaning it against bales of hay and filling it with blankets, hoping Rook and Noodle might find some warmth. But they didn't. Rook stood her ground, facing the chill, her feathers fluffed up against the cold wind, as if she was daring the mountain itself. Noodle stayed close, tucked under a warped plank of the shed, blinking slowly in the frosty light. I began to realize that this arrangement couldn't go on forever. Nature seldom makes exceptions, not for feelings and definitely not for miracles. Then a letter arrived. It was from a neighbor down the trail, Miss Cartwright, who believed in managing wildlife with a shotgun and strong opinions. She had seen Rook limping and acting oddly, and had reported it to the local game warden. Mara found out first, showing up at my cabin with urgency in her voice as she slammed the truck door. "They're thinking about removing her. They might trap her, relocate her, or worse if they think she poses a threat." That hit me hard. Rook had become more than just another bird to me, and Noodle, still too weak to fend for himself, would be left alone without his protector. In that moment, my focus shifted. It was no longer just about helping Rook and Noodle. It was about keeping them safe from everything else. I found myself sitting on the porch late at night, fingers wrapped around a cold mug of tea, eyes fixed on the shed, disappearing into the darkness. Out there, beneath the wind's whispers and the trees' creaks, Rook rested with her wings tucked in, as if guarding a broken armor. Noodle's faint meows drifted in and out, quiet as a whisper, nearly drowned out by the sounds of the forest. I couldn't help but ponder the fine line we were treading, between rescue and interference, between love and control. Was my desire to help truly for them, or was it more for my own comfort? Just hours earlier, Mara had left, torn between her professional duties and her instinct that this situation was special. "You could bring them in," she suggested carefully. "We could take care of Rook properly." She pointed out that Noodle had potential for foster care or even adoption. However, the current situation wasn't sustainable. That thought weighed heavily on me. If I took them in, I worried about disrupting something valuable. Yet, if I didn't, I risked losing them both to the cold predators or the harsh realities that humans create. It was no longer just about survival. It was about what survival really means, who it helps, and at what cost. The day after the frost melted, I found the shed empty. The nest of hay looked untouched, and the old plank where Noodle would usually rest still felt warm under my hand. But when I looked underneath, there was nothing. No falcon, no kitten, just a heavy silence that hung between the trees. I softly called their names, barely louder than a whisper, hoping for any response, but the forest remained still. It was as if they had been erased entirely. I spent hours searching the area, my boots sinking into the still frozen ground, my heart racing as if it had forgotten how to be calm. Every rustle in the underbrush and creaking branch made me jump. There were no signs of a struggle, no feathers, no tracks. It was as if they had simply walked into the woods, leaving no trace behind. Just before dusk, I found some clues. A series of shallow gouges on the bark of a cedar tree, too high for a cat but not quite within a falcon's reach. These claw marks seemed deliberate. Nearby, I noticed a round paw print pressed firmly into the mud. This was not their mark. A predator must have passed through, maybe a cougar or something even more threatening. The realization struck hard. Had Rook tried to move Noodle to safety? Had they been chased? Were they still alive? In that moment, our fragile sense of calm shattered. The balance of nature felt off, and it seemed like time was slipping away to make things right. That night, sleep was elusive. The forest felt heavy and steeped in an unsettling silence, as if the trees were watching closely. Sitting on the porch, flashlight in hand, I wrapped my old flannel around my shoulders and stared at the tree line. Around midnight, I thought I heard something, softer than a raccoon, heavier than a squirrel. But as I stepped off the porch, silence enveloped me once more. My heart ached with that familiar feeling, when you become attached to something fragile and suddenly wonder if it's still there. As morning broke over the ridge, Mara returned, her boots muddy and her eyes weary from a long night. She handed me a thermos of coffee without saying a word, her gaze fixed on the shed. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, she asked, "If we find them, would you keep him, Noodle?" Her gentle voice caught me off guard, pushing me to confront a choice I had been avoiding. Welcoming him into my life meant embracing responsibility and the risk of heartbreak, all wrapped up in a small, energetic orange bundle. Before I could fully process her question, Theo came out of the cabin, speaking more softly than usual. "There's something near the creek," he said, pointing towards the water with a pale hand. We moved quietly, our boots squishing in the mud beneath us. It wasn't long before we spotted them under a rocky overhang by the creek bed. Rook perched on a low branch, her eyes a mix of dullness and fierce spirit, while Noodle nestled at the base of a tree root, looking up at us with confusion and trust. In that moment, everything shifted. It wasn't about relief or victory. Instead, it was an understanding that our connection ran deeper than we had realized. We stayed by the creek, caught in a moment that seemed to stretch on forever. Soft golden light streamed through the trees, casting a warm glow on the mist rising from the water. The world felt as if it had paused, preserving an important moment. Rook lifted her wings slightly, showing discomfort but not aggression. I could see that the injury under her wing had worsened. Raw and swollen, it clearly needed urgent care. Without help, she might not survive, and neither would Noodle. Mara crouched down carefully, trying to maintain the stillness around us. "We don't have much time," she said quietly. "If we don't get her medical help, she won't make it. Maybe not today, but soon." Theo shifted nervously beside me. "What if we take her in? Will she be okay in captivity? Can she ever go back to the wild?" His tone was sincere, free from anger. "And what about him?" he asked, nodding at Noodle. "He's formed a bond with a bird that can't care for him. What happens if that bond is broken?" There were no simple answers. It felt like every option had a cost. I looked at this unusual family of feathers, fur, and their unspoken needs, feeling the weight of my decision press down on me. I had hoped nature would manage on its own, but it was clear that nature was asking for our help. We had a decision to make. Stepping in might save them, but it could also disrupt the delicate bond that had kept them alive until now. When we returned to the cabin, the air between us felt thick with unexpressed thoughts. Rook was still too weak to fly, and Noodle, sensing her friend's vulnerability, refused to leave her side. Mara had reached out to a wildlife specialist who could come with a mobile unit, but they wouldn't arrive until the following morning. We had just one night to figure out our next steps. Mara stood by the window, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the shapes of Rook and Noodle hidden under the tarp we had set up. We could give her a mild sedative, just enough to treat her wound. Then we could bring her back here and release her once she's recovered. No cages, no lengthy rehabilitation, she suggested. Her voice was steady, yet I could sense doubt lingering beneath the surface. But what if something goes wrong? What if she doesn't wake up? Noodle won't understand. Theo, seated at the kitchen table, was absent-mindedly spinning a spoon. You can't keep them together forever. Do you really think this falcon's gonna stick around and raise a cat? This isn't a fairy tale, he pointed out. I paused before answering. Part of me acknowledged his logic. Yet, another part, the one that had witnessed their special connection form, that had seen Rook's gentle movements and the way Noodle curled up against her, wasn't ready to separate them simply because it seemed impractical. As the temperature dropped and the wind rattled the cabin walls that night, I wrapped myself in a blanket, sitting by the door and listening to their rhythmic breathing in the dark. Did I truly have the right to make this choice? Still, I understood that a decision was necessary. Dawn crept in slowly and chillily, light filtering through the tree branches as if it hesitated to disturb what lay beneath. I was already awake, bundled in my jacket, sitting on the porch steps and watching the clearing where Rook and Noodle were nestled together. Sleep had evaded me, and I wasn't alone. None of us had rested well. The night felt precious and fragile, each hour weighed down with the unspoken realization that today, something important would change. The wildlife team was on the way, and Mara confirmed it softly over the phone. They would bring the supplies we needed to safely sedate Rook. This would let us clean and stitch her wound and potentially start her on antibiotics. Along with that, they were also bringing essential gear, capture crates, transport equipment, and paperwork. It was part of the process of turning wild animals into patients, marking their journey with a series of numbers. Theo stood nearby, arms crossed and watching closely. Although he usually approached things with skepticism, I could see worry etched in his tight jaw. He had grown quiet, no longer poking holes in our logic. Even he seemed to sense that the bond between the falcon and the kitten went deeper than reason. Mara, typically the one filled with direction, now seemed thoughtful and reserved. She crouched next to me and, without looking directly at Rook, shared her concerns. If she panics or lashes out, we could lose her. Maybe both of them. You understand that, right? I nodded slowly, feeling a tightness in my throat. We found ourselves at a crossroads, deciding between what was right and what was humane, weighing our urge to hold on against the necessity of letting go. In that quiet moment, a pressing question hung in the air. Were we really saving them, or were we interfering in a way we shouldn't? A gust of wind swept through, and the crunch of tires on the gravel road broke our stillness. The moment had come. The van arrived quietly, its tires parting the frost-damp earth with ease. A woman stepped out first. She looked to be in her mid-50s, her face marked by the sun, and her eyes held a steady gaze. Calm and composed, she introduced herself as Celia, the falcon specialist. Without a moment's pause, she began preparing the sedative, her hands moving with the ease of someone skilled in this line of work. However, as she listened to Mara describe the unique connection between the bird and the kitten, I noticed her brow furrowing slightly, a subtle hint of concern breaking through her usual calm. "I've never encountered something like this," she said softly, glancing toward the tarp where Rook perched. Her feathers fluffed defensively while Noodle stayed close beside her, like a steady heartbeat. "We need to proceed with caution." Time felt strange. Everything seemed to unfold both slowly and quickly at once. Together we stepped forward, Celia, Mara, and I, moving carefully through the clearing, our breaths held in the quiet. This time, Rook didn't make a sound. Instead, she watched us closely. Her eyes showed wariness, but also a sharp awareness, as if signaling a warning. Yet, she didn't attempt to escape. Perhaps she understood the situation, or maybe she had already made her choice. Just then, as Celia was about to lift the dart gun, Noodle surprised us by stepping right in front of her. His small, trembling form acted as a barrier between us and the falcon. There was no noise, just an undeniable show of defiance. In that brief moment, Celia lowered her weapon, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't do this," she said softly. "Not like this." A heavy silence enveloped us, filled with tension. The decision we needed to make lingered between us, pressing down like a weight. At that instant, I understood. We wouldn't take Rook today. Maybe not ever. So we took a step back. Slowly and cautiously, we created a little distance. For the first time since Rook came into my life, she closed her eyes, not to sleep, but as a gesture of trust. Whatever happens next would be on their terms. Weeks have passed since that morning by the creek, and they're still around. Not every day, and not always together, but enough to show their bond remains intact. Rook doesn't sit on the roof like a sentinel anymore. She comes and goes, stronger now, her flight steady and her wound healed, not just by time, but through her newfound independence. She hunts in the early morning, returning at dusk, gliding just above the treetops and circling once before landing near the woodshed. Noodle, a bit rounder and braver now, follows her like a furry shadow, too small to hunt, but too wild to be contained. Mara visits less frequently, and Theo has returned to the city, quieter than when he first showed up. I can see changes in both of them. Something has softened, something has shifted. There are fewer arguments about what we should have done, and more moments of quiet reflection about what really happened. We didn't save Rook and Noodle, they saved each other. And in some small way, they saved a part of us too. I can't say how long this will last. Maybe one day Rook will stop coming back. Perhaps Noodle will choose a different path, embracing a wilder life. But that's the reality of rescue, isn't it? It's rarely straightforward. It's complicated and fragile, filled with tough decisions and moments where the lines blur. Yet, it carries meaning, because sometimes nature tells its own story. All we can do is listen. If this story touched your heart, if Rook and Noodle made you feel something warm, consider passing it along to someone who might appreciate a reminder about unusual connections, new beginnings, or the quiet power of simply allowing things to unfold. You might also enjoy subscribing for more stories like this one, tales that explore the connection between nature and humanity, where life is rarely straightforward, but deeply meaningful. What would you do in a similar situation? Sometimes the hardest choice isn't about rescuing someone, it's about believing in their ability to handle things themselves. It can be tough to trust others, especially when we care about them. The urge to jump in and assist is strong, but often, the best way to support someone is to take a step back and let them navigate their own path. Have you ever experienced something like this? Thinking about those moments can shed light on why trust is so crucial in our relationships.